Today we're talking strategy for the Invictor tactical Warsuit, where someone in the Space Marine Armory had the great idea that maybe the pilot of a walker doesn't necessarily have to be dead. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're focusing on the Invictor, the big stompy war mech that is still somehow a stealth unit. In the video we're going to be taking a look at its datasheet, talking about its concealed positions rule, how I think about playing it in game, and whether or not I think they're a strong unit at the moment. If you were thinking about picking these up at some point soon, they're £37.50 or $60 from Games Workshop, though there is one in that new Start Collecting Space Wolves Combat Patrol box, and the Warsuit did also appear in the Space Marines Christmas Battle Force box, so there might well be a fair few more of them going online than there would be normally. If you are looking to pick one up within the UK, as always I do have my Element Games link which is down in the video description. They offer it at a decent discount, and anything bought through there does help to support the channel. So let's start by taking a look at the Invictor's stats then. The Invictor Tactical Warsuit is an elite's choice for Codex Space Marines, and it's 160 points, not mattering anymore whether you give it the Flamer or the Autocannon. Stats wise, it's basically a lighter and faster version of the Redemptor Dreadnought, a very decent impressive movement at 10 inches, weapon skill and ballistic skill 3+, strength 7, so strength 14 in combat, toughness 6, 13 wounds, 4 attacks, leadership 8 and a 3+ save. In terms of durability, I would say that point for point it is a little on the fragile side. At 13 wounds it is going to need a little bit of focused firepower, but with toughness 6 it's abnormally vulnerable to things like autocannons, which will cut through it almost as easily as dedicated anti-tank fire. It really does depend on what your opponent's bringing though. If they are bringing heavy weapons like las cannons and missile launchers, durability wise it's really not all that much behind the Redemptor Dreadnought, even despite Duty Eternal. In terms of keywords, it's a vehicle and it's not a core unit, so can no longer benefit from rerolls like captains and lieutenants. In terms of weapons, in combat it has its Invictor Fist, essentially a normal Dreadnought close combat weapon. It'll be hitting at strength 14, AP-3 and flat damage 3, so pretty efficient at punching holes in hard targets. With average rolling you can expect something like 2 failed saves from this thing against most targets, so maybe 2 dead Gravis Marines or 6 wounds on a vehicle. Despite being obviously fairly fighty in close combat, I would argue that the Invictor is pretty much equally as good at range, if not better, than it is in melee. This thing gets an absolutely insane amount of shots. 2 Iron Hail Heavy Stubbers will put out 8 shots at strength 4 AP-1. You've got a Heavy Bolter at the upgun damage profile of damage 2, and a Fragstorm Grenade Launcher as well. That's an average of 14 shots even before you take into account the main armament, the Twin Iron Hail Autocannon or the Incendium Cannon. The Twin Iron Hail Autocannon is a 6-shot autocannon essentially. 48-inch range, strength 7, AP-1 and flat damage 2. The other alternative is that Incendium Cannon, that's only 12-inch range, but it's essentially 2 heavy flamers strapped together, heavy 2d6, strength 5, AP-1 and damage 1, auto-hitting the target. While it's on its top bracket, you basically have to weigh up whether you want an average of 4 strength 7 damage 2 hits, or an average of 7 strength 5 damage 1 hits at 12-inch range. I think that they're both quite well balanced myself. They both do have their advantages. The Flamer's probably the slightly higher damage output and far better against hordes, and of course it doesn't care if it gets bracketed or not, it will still be auto-hitting. The autocannon, however, will be a little bit better against 2-wound infantry such as Primaris Marines, vastly superior if you ever encounter any toughness 6 targets, but most importantly has really long range, so you don't have to just target the closest thing to your Invictor, you get a lot more choice as to where you put that firepower. Of the two, I will admit that I personally prefer the autocannon. I just really like the flexibility and ability to target things a long way away, which synergizes very well with the rest of its weapons. I certainly don't think that the Flamer's a bad choice though. Either way, this thing is going to be an absolute machine at going through light infantry. It's got a very decent amount of shots, all with at least some AP and some with multi-damage, and it's particularly nasty turn 1 when you're in the Devastator doctrine. So in terms of special rules, concealed positions is the main consideration with the Invictor. It basically deploys like scouts, infiltrators or nurglings. You can set it up anywhere outside of your deployment zone, anywhere that's 9 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone or enemy models. Now honestly this was absolutely amazing in 8th edition, but in 9th it's just a bit more problematic. The potential for massive power is certainly there. You can get great line of sight with all of those guns on some key enemy units. You'll get a pretty much guaranteed first turn charge, as 10 inches will take you inside the opponent's deployment zone turn 1, and you can potentially also use it to deny any other pre-game move shenanigans, a bit of space on the board. Most of the time enemy units can't set up too close to this thing, or can't move too close to it pre-game. However, for all those advantages, they are mainly just advantages if you're going first. In the 9th edition missions, you don't know whether you're going to be going first or second until you've actually deployed everything and rolled the dice to see who goes first. It means at the time of deployment, you don't know whether you'll be going first or second for the Invictor, which means that it's pretty much equally likely to go on a first turn rampage and destroy a bunch of enemies as it is just to get shot straight off the face of the board. There's certainly some advantage to having a big fire magnet at the front of the army. It could draw fire away from all your other units, but I would describe the Invictor as only moderately tough. It means that the opponent is likely to be able to do some pretty efficient damage to your army, particularly as it's going to be so close, so their units should be in maximal effective range. They might even be able to completely ignore it from first turn shooting purposes and just delete it with melee units that never would have been able to get a charge unless you deployed it far forward. You are basically taking around a 50-50 chance of a big early loss, and it is typically going to be a unit that's going to heighten the first turn advantage to both players. On top of all that, against the wrong army, it can still sometimes be easily screened out by other enemy units that set up in the midfield, whether they're Nurglings, Infiltrators or Scouts. So concealed positions is a bit of a double-edged sword at the moment. It does allow you a bit more freedom, and it could be really devastating, but equally it could blow up in your face against the wrong opponent. I think that you could perhaps mitigate the swing a little bit by maybe taking 3 of them. Maybe your opponent can deal with 1 or perhaps even 2, but at least 1 should get through. But still, if they have an insane amount of anti-tank and delete all 3 of them, you've just lost a quarter of your army in 1 turn. Not exactly what I'd call ideal. In terms of buffs and other ways to get more out of the Invictor, there isn't an absolute ton that you can or want to do with it in my opinion. I think it would typically want to operate independently from characters anyway, as I'd still say that the concealed positions rule is the main reason that you want to take it, even if it does have its risks. If it does happen to be convenient for whatever reason though, then a Librarian with Psychic Fortress could be pretty good to give it a 5+ invul save, and Tech Marines can also repair it and give it +1 to hit with all that anti-horde weaponry. Stratagem wise, there isn't all that much going on either. 1 command point for Armour of Contempt is the only one that you'll be using in the main book. It's a bit situational. I'd say that you're more likely to use command rerolls to reroll charges than anything else. You can get a fair bit of benefits from the various different chapters though. Ultramarines have their fallback and shoot, which could potentially be useful, but I think that they might be one of the strongest chapters to use the Invictor at the moment, because they have that stratagem to redeploy units pre-game. You could potentially have a pair of these things, deploy them hyper-aggressively, find out whether you're going first or not, and if you're not, then you could just teleport them back into your own lines turn 1, not having them any more exposed than they would have been if they'd set up normally. I think that stratagem does really allow you to get the most out of that concealed positions rule in a way that pretty much every other chapter doesn't. Various other chapter tactics could be useful though. Raven Guard or Stealthy could give you some cover at range and add to the durability, as could Iron Hands with their 6+ Feel No Pain and the very nice slower degrading vehicle table. Salamander's rerolls to wounds can be handy in close combat, and of course they'll get +1 to wound with a flamer if your Invictors do manage to hang around in turn 2 and turn 3 and not just get shot off the board. Finally, for the assault chapters, I'd say that Space Wolves are possibly the most useful. They get +1 to hit on the charge, which is a very relevant buff having it hit on 2s, and is perhaps a bit more useful than say the Blood Angels one, as it will already be wounding on 2s in most circumstances. In game, I think that deployment is really the biggest decision you're going to make about the Invictor. A lot of the time it might not be surviving for much longer after that, so I think putting this down right can matter more than it does for almost any other unit. I think you basically have to analyse your opponent's army and decide whether putting him up very close to the enemy is going to actually get you more than it loses you. Perhaps if the opponent's got a whole ton of fragile damage dealers, it might be absolutely the right thing to do. You might be able to close in and kill a whole load of them and basically guarantee you a win if you go first. If they've got an absolute ton of close range melee troops, then it might not actually make any sense to deploy him really far up. It might just be best to hang back a fair bit and have a turn or 2 of shooting while they get close and then do a counter charge. Against a more balanced list, I would think about trying to hide him behind terrain or deploy him on the extreme flanks of the army. It might well be possible to hide from or outrange a serious amount of enemy firepower. Ideally you want him somewhere where he can deal a decent amount of damage to something important, but also not just be gone straight off the board with no consequence if the opponent goes first. In terms of when to deploy him in the deployment sequence, I would generally be trying to deploy him as late as possible against most armies. If you can see where the vast majority of their important units have gone, you might be able to put yourself in a position where you can wreak absolute havoc if you go first, or to keep him safe from the vast majority of threats. If they do have any units such as Nurglings, Scouts or Infiltrators though, then it might well be worth to deploy him fairly early, as otherwise you might see him screened out by these other units and not be able to deploy anywhere near anything of consequence. Unless you have decided to be cagey about using him, then the first turn's usually going to be about maximising damage, and I think about his firepower just as much as the melee. I've had some good success with one myself recently, being able to get some good lines of sight on things like Dark Reapers, which otherwise would have been completely hidden from the rest of my army. Long range and a decent amount of shots could really help clear out an important unit turn 1. I'd most certainly want to make a charge, though I wouldn't overestimate the melee damage output. Unless he rolls super hot, he's not going to be killing a tank in a turn, but he should do some reasonable damage. With his pile-ins and consolidates, I'd also think about trying to tie up as much as possible, and hopefully prevent a little bit of shooting next turn. So overall, there's not really too much that's exactly like the Invictor in 40k. A big stompy and shooty walker that can set up right next to the opponent, though doing so does have its own downsides. I'd say it's potentially strongest in an Ultramarines chapter, with that redeployment stratagem allowing you to get the best of both worlds out of concealed positions, and give it the get out of jail free card of rejoining your battle line if the opponent does get first turn. It could also be kind of fun to try and dial up the Alpha Strike to absolute maximum, maybe take 3 of these alongside some Raven Guard. They can infiltrate another unit forwards with a Warlord trait, and hopefully just overload the enemy army with loads of threats turn 1. Otherwise, I have to say that I think they're a bit swingy at the moment. They'll really amp up first turn advantage if you deploy them up front, and if you are just deploying them back in the deployment zone, then you might well have been better with something like the Redemptor Dreadnought, which is a bit tougher point for point with Duty Eternal, particularly against damage 2 weapons, has core for rerolls, and an absolute ton of guns on top of that. It's definitely an interesting unit though, and really good fun to use. And to be honest, it's probably for the best that it's a bit more balanced than it was in 8th edition, where they were near enough auto-includes in a Space Marine army when they first came out. I'll be interested to hear your experiences with Invictors down in the comments below. Have yours managed to do awesome damage turn 1, or just been gone straight off the board for no return? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We'll certainly be keeping the Space Marine unit reviews coming, with new videos out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been watching a fair few of the videos, then I'd just like to briefly mention the channel's Patreon page, which is down in the video description below. Making all of these videos does take a fair amount of time, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is massively appreciated. It is what keeps the channel going. Channel patrons get to see a video early each week, there's regular votes to see what sort of things happen next, and you get automatically entered into the monthly prize giveaway with a chance to win some really big model kits. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support the channel, then the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.